On the 21st of February 1944, 25 members of the French resistance were led into a small clearing inside of Fort Mont-Valerien in Paris, and opposite them stood an execution squad made up of German soldiers who were there to execute them. Throughout the Second World War, France suffered during the German occupation of the land, and at times the French people would turn to resistance activities that became infamous. But the French resistance are considered some of the best organised and feared opposition that the Germans had to face in World War II, and they were backed up by Allied help. For example, British Special Operations Executive, a spy network who worked in collusion to bring about the end of the occupation. There were many in France who would collaborate with the enemy. For example, some women were dragged into the streets following D-Day, and those who were accused of sleeping with the enemy were subjected to the ugly carnival, where they had their heads shaved in shocking scenes. But inside of a fort in Paris, there were hundreds of executions carried out by the Germans during the Second World War, and because of this, Fort Mont-Valerian became infamous and very feared. Join us today as we look at this, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Fort Mont-Valerian is a fortress which still stands today in a western Paris suburb, and it was built in 1841 as part of a series of defences to defend what was a modern city. It has been a site occupied for many centuries, as religious hermits used to live there, but then as the French army became more feared around the world, and following Napoleon's exploits across Europe, there were many more defences created around France. The fortress was made to defend Paris during the Franco-Prussian War, and it was one of the strongest, protecting the city, and it would be able to be battered by artillery for months on end without breaches appearing. In fact, the fortress became so impenetrable that during the signing of the armistice, the Germans were allowed in 1871 to occupy the fort and the strongest part of Paris's defences, in exchange for allowing food and resources to get to the starving French people. It continued to play a key role in Paris's defence, and the army would continue to use it as a base and also as a prison. Colonel Henry, who was involved in the Dreyfus affair, would be held inside of the prison, and whilst there he would cut his throat with a razor that the guards left with him. But as the Second World War erupted, the city of Paris would suffer a great deal. Paris began mobilising for war in September 1939 with the Nazi invasion of Poland, but the war would not come to the city for a while. On the 10th of May 1940, the Germans attacked France, and within a matter of weeks and months the French army would be defeated. The French government left Paris, and the German occupation of the city then began on the 14th of June 1940. Inside of the city, the occupation for the people of Paris was at times frustrating, limited and suffering. A curfew was brought in from 9 at night until 5 in the morning, and the city would be placed in darkness at night to protect from bombing. But food began to be rationed, as well as coal, clothing and tobacco, and 1 million people left the city for the provinces, where there were less Germans and more places to obtain food. But inside of the city the Germans imposed their laws and policies upon the people, and Jews were forced to wear the yellow Star of David. They were banned from certain jobs. But then roundups and mass deportations of people from the French capital to concentration camps, such as Auschwitz, began, and terror came to the city. The French resistance would work underground inside of Paris, and they sometimes attacked German officers, but this would be dealt with ruthlessly as horrific reprisals were ordered. But Fort Mont-Valerian would during the Second World War become a place which was associated with torture and execution. It was used as a site of imprisonment by the Nazis, and the Germans would bring in transports of prisoners from other sites around France to be housed there or executed there. The main group of people who were sent to the fortress were those men who were involved in the French resistance. The Germans feared these people, as they often had intense and great knowledge of the local area and region, and this was a huge advantage they had over the Germans. Resistance members would conduct many different activities, from blowing up railway lines and derailing trains, to stockpiling weapons, and even luring Germans through devious means to their deaths. But the Germans would use fellow French men known as a militia or the milice to hunt resistance members down, and the milice were considered more dangerous for the resistance than the German SS or the Gestapo, as these collaborators also held very skilled knowledge. But during the war there were more than 1,000 hostages held there and members of the resistance, and some historians claim that this figure is as high as 4,500. However, what was most sinister at Fort Mont-Valérien was the executions that occurred there. There were 1,014 recorded executions carried out by the German army there between 1941 and 1944, and all of these were men. They were executed by firing squad each time, and inside of the country at the time, women could not be executed by firing squad. They wanted to execute Olga Bancic, a member of the Manouchian group there, but the Germans legally could not do this, and she would be sent to Germany, and specifically a prison in Stuttgart, where she was beheaded either by an executioner and his axe, or a guillotine. The execution process inside of the fortress would be as followed. The victims would be brought to the prison on trucks. They were then held inside of a disused chapel for some time, before it was time for their execution to occur. The executions were occurring 100 metres away, and these victims would hear the bullets of those who went before them, and the Germans would then bring new victims over to an embankment near to the fortress. Then these people would be tied to an execution stake, and opposite them was a firing squad made up of many German soldiers armed with their rifles. When the command to ready was given, the Germans stood there with their weapons pointed at the victims, before they then shot through them. Following this, the deceased were then collected and were buried in various different cemeteries around locations in Paris. Some of those who were executed inside of the fort were members of the French resistance. For example, on the 29th of August 1941, Henri Honor d'Estienne d'Orves. He was said to have been the first martyr of Free France, and was a sailor who worked with the resistance, setting up new networks. On the 15th of December 1941, there was a collection of 70 men executed on the same day at the fortress, and this included 53 Jews. Further members of the resistance were executed, and one network which was dismantled by the French police was a Manouchian group. These were a number of resistance members that followed the Armenian poet Misak Manouchian, and he would write his final words before his death that said that, "Today it is sunny. I look at the sun and the beauty of the natural world I so loved, as I bid farewell to life and to you all, my beloved wife and dear friends." It became the execution chamber for the resistance, and people knew if they were captured, then there was a good chance they would end up tied to a stake inside of the Parisian fortress. But on the 11th of August 1944, the biggest mass execution occurred inside of Mont-Valerien, and on this day 93 prisoners were executed on the firing range and were dispatched ruthlessly. The fortress today has become a memorial for those members of the resistance that fought to try and free and rid the German occupation of France. But there is also an American military cemetery on the site of the fortress in Paris, where over 1,500 American soldiers who died during the First World War were buried. But the executions that occurred inside of the Parisian fortress were ruthless, and it showed how brutal the German occupation of the French capital could be. The Germans would take no prisoners, and they would not think twice to condemn someone, but the executions inside of Fort Mont-Valérien would occur most days, and in some days dozens were being shot. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.